This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is time. It's the second in my trilogy on time. Philosopher Eric Rubenstein is the man before you, and the conversation will begin when we return. The subject is time. This is the second in my trilogy on time. I had a physicist speaking a few weeks ago. Now I have a philosopher, and I'll follow up with a theologian to end the trilogy. But Eric Rubenstein is the philosopher that I am speaking to. So Eric, welcome. And if you can give a little bit of background about yourself, your work in general, and anything specific to time that you've written.
Thank you. Nice to be with you this morning. Let's see. I received my PhD from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm presently an associate professor at Indiana University, Pennsylvania. I teach a wide range of classes, including one on the philosophy of time, and I've done various bits of research into the nature of time, published an article or two, given presentations on time, and presently have philosophy of time as one of my research areas and things that I'm working on now.
Most people assume time, they live within time. Time is one of those things like air that you don't think about time unless you are choking and cut off from air. What would the philosophy of time be? Are you discussing the beginning of time? What time is? What is the field of the philosophy of time?
Well, I like the way you put it. There's something kind of paradoxical, I think, about time. It's something that we are all familiar with and build our lives around, but its closeness to us kind of paradoxically makes it hard for us to pin it down and to study it. Like many things, we don't learn about things that are closest to us. We tend to learn about things that are far away. So color is another example. When philosophers turn to the philosophy of time, there's a wide range of debates that they have. They have debates about the structure of time. So, for instance, whether it makes sense or could be possible for time to have a beginning, or whether time could end, or whether time could branch, whether it's able to flow in more than one direction. So there are questions about the structure of time. There are questions about our experience of time, such as the flow of time that we use the metaphor of, and whether we can say something more precise and non-metaphorical about the flow of time. There are theological questions about whether a godlike being is outside of time and whether there's a kind of time that's appropriate for that kind of being, say eternity, and how that relates to human experience of time. So there's a wide range.
Well, one of the reasons I do these trilogy shows on big questions like existence, death, evil, time, and a few other things like consciousness is because, to me, the three major ways that human beings look at the world tend to be the scientific method, science, the theological, that there's a God, and then philosophy. And philosophy is somewhere in between the other two. So, like when I talked with the physicists, we talked about things like the block universe, whether all of time is set out from the beginning, meaning that there's no free will. When I talk with theologists, I usually talk about the mind of God or how it relates to consciousness or something. So if science has, say, the physical, the hard stuff of time covered, and religion has sort of the softer, more emotional side of what time might be, where does philosophy fit in? Do you take little bits from each end, and what is in the center of the debate about time that philosophy is more apt to be good at than religion or science?
That's a good question. That's a tough question. For a long time, philosophers have supposed or presupposed that they could figure out questions about the nature of time just by reflection, just by engaging in the philosophical method of reasoning and posing arguments. Increasingly, I think philosophers recognize that time is one of those areas that is going to have to be informed by what our best scientific theory has to say, and is also going to be informed by, say, what a religious perspective would have on time. So philosophy is, I don't think there's a hard and fast distinction between the scientific investigation of time, the philosophical investigation, and the theological. I think the lines are blurry. Questions that you posed, say, about the physicists, questioning about the block universe, and whether we have free will. I think those are just as much philosophical questions as they are questions for a physicist. And I think that's one of the things that's exciting about time, but it's also one of the things that makes it challenging, is that you have to essentially have your feet in all these different camps in order to be able to try to make progress with the nature of time.
Well, let me talk about the thing that is most associated with time in the human experience, and that's memory. Memory, as most people who've done scientific testing on it, is very malleable. And we think of time itself as somehow being written stone, that as sort of, say, the dot or the singular point of the present moves from the past and into the future, that it sort of freezes everything in the past into what really happened. Do you think that time is something like that? That's a physical process outside of us, or is memory is not just a human, but let's say any sentient creature that has a memory of something? It could be a cat remembering where the bird eggs were, or something like that. That consciousness acts upon time in some way.
Let's see. I think it's fair to say that if you take different philosophical perspectives on time, you can roughly group them into two categories or two camps. On the one hand, you've got those who believe and argue that time is essentially mind dependent, and if there weren't humans or other beings with a consciousness like ours, there wouldn't be time. So time is wholly dependent upon humans. And then you've got others who think that time is, as you put it, a physical process that exists independently of us. And we humans do our best to try to figure out the properties of those independently existing processes. But it's real in its own right, as opposed to being dependent upon us.
Yeah.
When it comes to memory, I think you can go both ways. You can think of memory as something that's constructed by us. You can also think of it as, like time, having fixed facts about what actually happened that we may or may not be able to access or do a good job at recalling.
There's an old saying that appears at the end of a great Woody Allen film called Another Woman, that goes, is time a thing that you, or is memory a thing that you have, or a thing that you've lost? And in a sense, it's both, depending on how you look at it, because a memory is a thing that regards the past, but it's also something that's gone by. When you spoke about time and whether it's real or is it conscious, I would have to say that it's real, because, I think just one look at, say, the geological record of the passage of time, dinosaur bones and all other ancient animals, it seems to me just ludicrous to assume that these things didn't experience some sort of reality. It's sort of like, it's almost like a kind of religious blindness to the passage. So wouldn't something like the geologic record be a strong argument against the idea that time is constructed by a sentient consciousness?
Well, I think what's at issue is whether time as we experience it as humans, the way you referred to it before, as sort of this moving now, where things, depending on how you look at it, they either come from the future into the present and move into the past, or we sort of slide along the timeline. What's at issue is whether time as experienced by humans maps onto something in reality that corresponds to that kind of moving now. Clearly, there's a physical process, whether you want to talk about entropy or appeal to thermodynamics. Clearly, there's a physical process that is involved in aging, but I think the philosophical question is whether the experiences we have of time, whether those are wholly dependent upon us, or whether a physical description of reality would also have to make room for something like a now and the past or present, or whether it would be, as you mentioned before, something like a block universe where all the relations between events are fixed, and there's no dynamic element or changing element.
Well, when you talk about that, it brings up to me the idea of like a mayfly that may live only 24 or 48 hours. And so I've read that some people have thought that depending upon how a consciousness might process something, for example, people have thought of maybe towards the end of the universe, if we do live in a Big Bang universe that's going to eventually wind down and get cold, that thought processes might take billions of years. So, i.e., a mayfly's 48 hours may to it experientially seem as long as the 75 or 80 years that a human being might live. And in a similar way, you could posit a being, an energy being towards the end of the universe that may live trillions of years, but the way it moves so slowly and thinks so slowly, time to it may seem like it only lives what to us might be a few decades as well. So is that what you're talking about, the experience of time?
Yes, that's certainly part of it, the experience of time. But when you ask the question about how does it connect with, say, what a physicist says, the question becomes something like whether the structure and experience of time as we know it has a physical correlate. Think about maybe an analogy or a comparison with another field might help. We can ask about color as we experience it,
Yeah.
The richness of reds and bright yellows. And then we can ask whether in giving a description of physical reality, we need to also include something like colors. And usually people think, no, we don't need to include colors into a description of what reality is like. We can get by talking about mass and velocity and shape and the kinds of physical properties that you would use to explain, say, billiard balls colliding. There's not a need to include something like the properties of color. And so, too, you can ask about time. Do we need to include something like a now or a flow of time into our physical description of reality?
The way that you speak of that, it almost sounds like you think that the perception of time is almost like a sense, like the five basic senses, since you use sort of an analogy to color. Do you think that perhaps the way that humans experience time is something of sort of a sixth sense? I know there are some minor senses, but of like the five major senses, that time perception may be a sense, a biological thing that evolved within us.
I wouldn't be surprised to find that when we learn more about neuroanatomy, that we find something like a way of processing and keeping track of time and the passage of time. I think there is probably something like a time sense, however you want to describe it, because we are able to, I think, even in the absence of things changing, we are able to track the passage of time. So I think we are latching on to something by whatever you want to call it, a sense, a way of perceiving.
Human nature, though, I mean, if you look culturally, and I'm sure you know that there have been some cultures that have perceived time in a circular way. Some Eastern religions, some of the more like Native American, and some hunter-gatherer, not religions, but cultures look at, they look at time constantly repeating in a sense, in a circular, rather than the Western arrow of time. Do you find any consonance with that point of view, or is that just a cultural affectation?
Well, that's actually one of the things that I'm interested in, and the way at least I frame it or think about it is that you might think that the way we experience time and how we experience time is determined to a large extent by the language we use. And that if our language is, say, structured to not have certain verb tenses or words for referring to the distant future, as you find in some of these different cultures, that their experience of time very well may be different because the language that they use sort of constructs the reality for them. And our language does the same for us. So it's a fairly controversial thesis that what we experience is determined by language, but that's the way I would approach it. And it comes out of work from various anthropologists who encountered, say, Hopi nation and tribes within Africa who don't seem to have the same kind of vocabulary or language to speak of time the way we do. And so perhaps their experience of time is very different because of the way in which their language essentially constructs the reality for them.
Well, let's use this as a jumping off point, and let's talk about your specific work then, because this seems to be in your purview. So tell me some of the things specifically that you have researched about time as it refers to, culturally or, in the way people perceive it.
Well, let's see. I think, like many people in academia, I can speak of the things that I'm officially researching, and then things that are interests of mine that I'm reading, but I haven't gotten to the point where I'm ready to say something in a journal, say, or in a paper. So the stuff about whether our experiences are structured and determined by the language we speak, that falls for me more on the side of to be researched and to be written of, as opposed to things I've already done some work on.
Well, let's talk about what you've done work on first, and then we can get a bit more speculative.
Well, one of the first things that I did was I was interested in the philosophy of Husserl, and what was striking about his philosophy and others that he was influenced by and who were influenced by him was the idea that our experience of time is not the experience of this instantaneous now, where we go from one instantaneous now to the next instantaneous now to the next, where what's real is simply that moment of nowness, for lack of a better phrase, and the future and the past are both essentially unreal, and only what's real is this moment of time that moves. That's one way of thinking about the nature of time and our experience of it. The other is, with figures like Heidegger and Husserl and Merleau-Ponty and many others, is to think of our experience of time as what I call a temporal spread, that it includes what we've recently experienced, the recent past, and it also includes, as strange as it may seem, it also includes a kind of experience of the future, of what is yet to be happened, of what is yet to happen. And that was one of the first things that I was drawn to, was trying to understand in particular the role that the future could serve in our experience of time, and how it would be possible for there to be an experience of the future in our experience of time, given that the future hasn't happened yet.
Well, let me just ask, when you talk about the future, are you talking about the human ability, for example, to think probabilistically, i.e. that, I have a date with Sally Lou tomorrow, so it's probable that I'm going to get a kiss, and I spend the next 24 hours thinking, ooh, that's going to be a nice that she's going to kiss me. Is that what you mean? Something like that?
No, I mean something much more direct and immediate. So, for instance, let's talk about the past, because that's always it's always better, I think, to start with something we've got a firmer grasp on before we move to something more elusive and speculative. When it comes to the past, say, you are able to understand what I'm uttering now as part of a sentence because somehow your consciousness is retaining the words that the sentence began with.
Yeah.
And a particularly long sentence, that's kind of an impressive feat, and one that we can wonder how it happens, that the past is still alive such that you can make sense of a sentence. Or to use another example that Husserl uses, when you hear the notes of a melody, you're not just hearing singular notes. That wouldn't give you the experience of a melody. It would give you experience of disjointed, unconnected notes.
Yeah.
So somehow, notes that you had experienced are still alive and present in consciousness in a way that allows you to connect what you're experiencing now with what you had experienced. And so, too, it's thought that there is a way in which what is about to happen, what is going to happen, or our sense of the future is also part of our experience of time. The present, the past, and the future are all bundled together into our experience of what's happening.
Well, I can understand the past in the sense, and I know what you're talking about. If you think of time as, say, like, a film strip where each thing, like each word is a discrete little piece of film strip, and how do we get from one? The time is, in a sense, sort of like a film that, or an old-fashioned before digital, going through the reels and passing through the light that's being shown, and we get the illusion of movement. But I'm still a little. Explain how the future could be thought of in that way. I mean, are we talking just 10 seconds into the future, 10 minutes into the future, 10 hours?
It would be short. I think just as our retention of the past is fairly short in our immediate experience, it would be short. And that's something that actually psychologists wonder about and study, especially when it comes to the past. How long is our retentive memory, which is one of the phrases they use? How long is that we're able to hold things in consciousness? But you're right, the future is much harder to figure out how to think about and how it could be part of our experience. So here's an example that might help a little bit. Back in the days where we listened to full albums of music and not just mixes, if you knew an album very well, when you were listening to one song, as that song started to end, your mind would essentially leap ahead to the future to which song was going to come next. Mm-hmm. And if for some reason a different song showed up as the next song that you hear, you would have a kind of jarring experience of being surprised. And I think that's because, and the only way to make sense of that is because you've got certain kind of expectations, and maybe that's a way to make sense of how the future figures into our experience. So we've got what's happening now, what's recently happened, and our expectations of what is about to happen. And perhaps that's the way in which the future is part of our experience of what's happening.
Would this be related to deja vu?
I think there is a connection there where we have a feeling of what is happening as something that's happened before. So we are essentially throwing ourselves ahead into the future where we can have experiences of something that we do expect, where what happens aligns with our expectations or doesn't align and gives us that feeling of surprise. And also those unusual experiences where we have this vague sense that we've been here before.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to me, though, because the past, we have experienced it presumably, and it's not just a delusion. For example, if at the age of 15, your English teacher had you read the Odyssey, and then when you're 45 or 50, you decide, well, I'm finally going to read Ulysses by James Joyce. And you say, oh, these episodes remind me of some of the things from the Odyssey. And that's because even over 3 or more decades, you've retained something of it. But on the other hand, if you had never read the Odyssey and you're reading James Joyce, and then, or you just read James Joyce, and then you open up the Odyssey, you're probably not going to be able to imbue things backwards from reading Joyce into the Odyssey as you're reading and say, oh, well, of course, Odysseus is going to go through the Straits of Messina or something in this scene. So there would seem to me that there is something then at fundament that maybe we're talking about the future as generated within the human mind, and there's expectations, whereas the past is still more bedrock. Wouldn't that be?
I think I would agree with the gist of what you're getting at. For Husserl and others in his tradition, they were often focused on our kind of immediate experience of time and thought that there was something happening in that immediate experience of time that included, as I've been trying to find the words for, what's recently happened, what's our expectation, as well as what's happening now, and that's somehow a separate kind of experience and one that comes from memory, and that memories of things in the distant past, or even past beyond this kind of temporal spread that I've spoken of, that's a different kind of experience. That memory is supposed to be different from the way in which you're retaining in consciousness, say, the thoughts, the words that began this sentence. So I would agree with the gist of what you're saying, but I think the focus is slightly different. I'm trying to make sense of our immediate experience of time and what it's like and how it's possible for us to experience not just the present, but also what's recently happened, as well as the sense in which we are thrown ahead into the future.
Well, how would you sort of approach that from a more rational or scientific perspective? I know you're a philosopher. I mean, is this just listening to anecdotes of people who have had experiences like this, or is there a way to, test it? Because it's, a lot of times when you talk about like supernatural, paranormal phenomena, people who claim to be able to do A, B, or C, you put them in a scientific setting, and then all of a sudden, the excuse is, well, I can't do it because the hot lights are on me and I'm feeling pressure and whatnot. So is there any way to empirically test the idea that we can have even just glimmers of a few seconds ahead of time?
That one, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there's a way to ground that in a scientific investigation. When it comes to the past, that's a fairly well-documented phenomena that psychologists and people who study essentially neuroanatomy, that's a fairly well-documented phenomena that they've studied, and they've been able to actually give a measure for how long in the past we're able to hold things in consciousness. The future part of that temporal spread, that's the more controversial one, and that's one that I'm not sure. I'm just not sure how one would go about testing it. So it definitely falls on the more speculative side. But part of what the project was for some of these philosophers was a kind of Kantian, as I think of it, a Kantian question, which is to ask, how is this experience possible? How is the experience of a melody possible, where you've got the notes that you're presently hearing, your retention of the notes that you've previously heard, your expectations about which notes are to come? How is that all contained within an instantaneous or instantaneous act of awareness, that right now, at this moment of awareness, I'm able to somehow get the past and the future both into them?
Yeah, listening to music or reading a story or watching a film, in a sense, are simple experiences, say, compared to, say, walking to work, having a conversation with one of your colleagues, then you enter your room and you've got 20 kids in your classroom and you're going to teach them a lesson, and they all have their minds buzzing off in a dozen different directions or more. So is there a way that the more simple idea of, say, what happens between each note and how you make a song out of individual notes, how does that complex out into the multivaried and the variegated ways that human beings interact that are much more complex than just listening to a song?
Let's see. Are you asking about the diversity of the kinds of things that people experience?
Well, what I'm trying to get at is that if we accept, say, if we accept that there may be a several second ability to somehow anticipate the future by just listening to a song, that's a fairly linear, that's a fairly straightforward process. You know, it's uncluttered. But as I said, the interactions of going to your classroom and then giving a presentation to a couple of dozen students is going to be much more complex, I would think, by multiples than just listening to the notes of a song. So that that would seem to that would seem to require a human ability that's just virtually almost superhuman if we believe, like you said, that we can anticipate slightly. And I just use the word anticipate. That may be the wrong word, but that's probably the best word that I can
Yeah.
come up with.
Well, I think the idea is that it's what's being recalled or retained in consciousness and what's being anticipated isn't so much particular experiences, particularly when it comes to the future. I mean, we are not, as humans, we are not fortune tellers. We can't see into the future in a sense of knowing which events are going to happen, but we can still perhaps have a sense of the time that is yet to be experienced as well as the time that has been experienced. So in a way, it's trying to understand, the project is trying to understand the structure of consciousness, whatever the contents of that conscious experience may be, where the focus is on not what particular things are experienced, remembered, or expected, but kind of the foundation that it all rests on.
Well, I see that a couple of years ago you gave a talk, it looks like a presentation called Relations and the Essence of Time. Does that have any bearing on what we're just talking about now? And if not, what was that paper about?
No, it's really a different subject, and it's or different topic, and that's really what my recent work on time is trying to focus on. There are different ways of making sense of our experience of time and the nature of time. We can speak of, as we have been doing, we can speak of time as involving this moving now, whether it's a moving instantaneous now or a moving sort of temporal spread, as I've been trying to make sense of. There's that way of understanding it, but then there's also a way of understanding time as simply a structure of related events. And some things are before other things, and some things are after, and that gives us the structure and nature of time. You mentioned the block universe, and that's essentially what I'm trying to speak of now, what's sometimes called the B series view of time, that time is just a number of related events or moments, and there's nothing dynamic or changing, there's just the structure of the events. If that's right, then the next question to ask is about the nature of that structure. What is the structure of time? Does it involve an endless past and an infinitely open future? Does it involve a circular loop of time? Is it linear? Does it always have to move in one direction? What exactly is the structure of time? One way to think about it is, because time is so difficult to think about, we often use stand-ins or ways of representing time. So we use a line, and we use that to depict time. Well, is that the right way to think of time as essentially a line that moves in infinite wall on both sides?
Yeah.
Or is it more like a ray, where it's got a starting point, where it began and moved into the future? Is it possible that time could fork?
Yeah.
So what is the structure and nature of these relations that constitute time? That's what some of my more recent work has been on.
Well, a couple of the things that come to mind using what you just said is the idea of causality and also purpose, because we derive purpose, it seems, from the way things flow, and things seem to flow causally within time. I mean, no omelet has ever gotten cooler, disassembled itself, jumped back into a cracked egg, and whatnot. And I know some physicists have said that, well, it's theoretically possible that it might, but it may take 10 to the 10 trillion years or whatnot for something like that to happen. But it seems it seems that human beings have evolved well enough to perceive their reality. Now, the question, I would think, that time is time something that we evolved? Is it an evolved artifact, or is it something outside that we have evolved within? Where would you fall on that? Do you think, and is time something that a perception, as I had mentioned, that we have evolved, or have we evolved within the constraints of time? Do you think, and therefore perceive it quite lucidly?
Well, this goes back to one of the things we had started with in the very beginning about whether time is dependent upon human beings for its existence, or whether the properties of time that we experience have some kind of correlate in the physical world. I've come to believe the latter. I used to think that our experiences of time were really dependent upon us, and that things like a moving now were only present because of us, and the nature of time and the structure of time was dependent wholly on human consciousness. But I've come to think that's mistaken, and that we can give an adequate and accurate account of what time is by talking about, say, the physical processes that you mentioned that help explain why time moves in one direction. And so I do think time is something that exists independently of human beings.
Yeah, and I mentioned purpose or purposiveness, and the thing that always for me, just as a layman, is when people talk about time. Or a couple of days ago, I interviewed a fellow about the idea of a multiverse, and you talked about forking time, which would, in some senses, lead to the ideas of multiverses. It's that if we wonder, well, look how complex everything is. I mean, if the universe, at least just our universe, forget if there's a multiverse, if the universe goes beyond even what we can see, whether it's billions of light years across or infinite, at any given snapshot moment, there would be an infinity of things, a near infinity of things that would be happening on an infinity of worlds in an infinity of amount of ways. And with such complexity, it would seem to me that things like the block universe would require such an artificer or such an intelligence, whether artificial or not. It would come to, well, why would anything want to even do that? So it seems to me that the most likely explanation is that this just happened in some way, and over random processes, over whether it's billions or trillions or however many years, that these things have just fallen into place in some natural way. And it's certainly worth asking, well, are there laws, cosmic laws, that define why it happened? But it would seem to me that the utter randomness of things, including time, would argue against a natural process rather than an artificer. So I know I'm getting a little bit away from time itself. Is that more akin to your view? Because a lot of people would argue that time, just like the idea of the clockmaker in evolutionary terms, argues for God. Some people say that time itself is a good argument for God because God knows everything in religious people's minds.
Let's see. I think the human experience of what happens, of course, is going to be limited. An individual human only gets a glimpse of part of their world, and our world may be only part of the rest of what there is. I think most people who study time, they're interested in the relations that exist between, let's say, moments of time or events in time, and the particulars of the events, say, that are related. Those don't matter so much. I mean, that's sort of outside the purview of a philosophical investigation to the nature of time. As for the second part, the reference to sort of the theological perspective. There again, I think the philosophical enterprise project is really of a piece with that theological one. I don't think it's possible to separate them out, because we still are wrestling with questions about the nature of time, the nature of the past, the relationship between memory and what actually happened. So all those questions are still there, whether we're talking about the human experience of time or whether we're speculating about a non-human consciousness that's, say, able to take in everything all at one glimpse, or grasp everything all at once, which is sometimes the way people describe a godlike being's awareness of the world, like having all the stills of a film strip all laid out, and being able to grasp them all at once, as opposed to a sequential order of the way humans experience them.
You had just mentioned that you have come to believe that time is somehow a phenomenal rather than epiphenomenal to consciousness. Is that the dominant view now in philosophy, either in the U.S. or worldwide? And if not, how do you what is the dominant philosophy or idea about time, and why do you think that that's wrong?
Well, I think that it's definitely one of the major ongoing debates between people who study the nature of time, whether to think of things like the now that we experience and the movement that we use, what we try to describe the movement of ourselves through time, or whether time is missing that kind of moving dynamic element. I think that at least is one of the major debates. As for which side people follow on, my guess is that increasingly people are opting for the view that time is this series of relations, something like what you call the block universe, as opposed to being comprised of a moving now, or, I'll leave it at that. And I think one of the reasons why people have moved to that debate is that side is that if we try to give a physical description of time, one that also included a now and gave special status to the now that we experience, it's hard to think of or figure out what the physical correlate of that would be. What's now seems to be relative to human experience. And we know from, say, special relativity, that even the order of events that we experience, much less what's now and what's real, is going to vary depending on people's frame of reference. So I think it's because of the desire to find an account of time that meshes with our best physical theories about the universe that have led people, or many people at least, to shy away from thinking of time as constituted with this moving now.
What is the biggest problem now within current philosophy regarding time? Is there a sticking point? What is the biggest debate within the community?
Well, the one I've just been talking about, I think, as sometimes people call it, the A series versus the B series, where the A series is thinking of time as a series of events that have give a special status to what's now, as opposed to something more static. I think that is one of the major debates, and people have argued for that, and the debate has kind of evolved over the centuries that philosophers have been studying time. Other debates that I think people are waging are attempts to find physical processes that would explain our experiences of time. So you mentioned before an omelet that comes together because we've created it, as opposed to an omelet that suddenly just forms itself, or that goes from being an omelet and separates itself back into its parts that go tidally back into their containers, attempts to find what physical processes could explain those elements of time that we experience. And sometimes people make reference to, just as I think you had in mind, something like the laws of thermodynamics, in particular entropy, that understanding the movement of time is essentially probabilistic. Yes, it's possible for things to reverse themselves, but that's a very low probability as opposed to increased entropy, which is a much higher probability. So I think those are two of the major debates. There are more esoteric, you might say, debates about the structure of time. If you bring in questions about a godlike being, you may find yourself asking questions about whether it's possible for time to have a starting point, an end point, whether all times are real, whether only the present time is what's real and the past and the future, those are unreal until essentially the spotlight of the now shines on them. Those I would list as some of the major debates within the philosophy of time.
Yeah, human beings tend to have a difficult time with large abstract concepts like deep time, for example. The idea that the Earth was only 6,000 years old or older than 6,000 years old. The idea of infinity, the idea of nothingness. You know, when we think of nothingness, we think of blackness, and blackness isn't nothingness, though. And, you know, if time did start at the Big Bang and there is no multiverse and this is all that there is, well, what was before time? Well, we say there was some quantum foam, but again, that's not nothingness, so there must have been some way to measure that. But I would be remiss in talking about time if I didn't get to the idea of free will. And when I've argued with people who are theists, and I'm an agnostic and atheist, I'm not a hard atheist like Richard Dawkins. I don't want to send theists off to death camps or anything, but you know, the idea of a block universe very much is sort of the scientific version of God, because I've heard a lot of the wriggling arguments about, well, you can have an all-knowing God, an all-powerful God, and still have free will. And I said, well, only if you don't understand language and what free will actually states, because you simply cannot. It is logically dissonant from the idea of a God. Because if God knows everything, or if there is a block universe and everything is plotted out, then free will can be nothing but an illusion. So it seems to me that most people, your average person, if you were to pull them off the street like they did on the old Candid Camera show and ask them, what is the thing most dear to you or essential to you when you think about time? I think if you just toss some things out, they'd say, oh, free will. Yeah, I decide whether I want to be a plumber or a cop or a doctor. I decide whether I want to go to that restaurant or go home and make a beef stew. These essential kinds of ability to choose seems to be essential to people's concept of time. What are your ideas about free will, both just as a concept in and of itself and the theological arguments as related to the block universe?
Let's see. That's tough. Boethius, early medieval philosopher, was one of the first to struggle with this question. How can you make free will of humans compatible with a God that knows all? If God knows all, then presumably God knows what we're about to do. And if what we're about to do is already there for God to know, it must be because it's somehow etched into the way the universe will unfold. And that seems incompatible with free will. So one way to go is to turn the question back to, well, what do you mean by free will? What is your description of what free will would look like? And then go see if there's anything that corresponds to it in the way the world is. If you think of free will as requiring, essentially, at any moment of time, there's multiple possibilities of choice, then that does seem to be particularly difficult to reconcile with an all-knowing God who sees everything, including what we're about to do. I tend towards, I think, what sometimes people call a hard determinist position that thinks we don't ultimately have free will, however we choose to describe it. We think of ourselves as having free will, and that's perhaps good enough for us, but ultimately we don't. So that's a kind of easy way out of the problem, is just to deny that we have free will.
Well, then that would be, I think, de facto an argument for the block universe, would that not?
I don't think necessarily. I think you could still argue that time as experienced by us includes the experience of change, of a now that moves into the future, or that the future comes to us. And you can either argue that those experiences, while real to us, ultimately aren't accurate if we were giving a description about the way the world is, or that the way things unfold for us, including our experience of the now, that's just also something that's built into the nature of the universe, that's deterministic. So in other words, I think there are really two different debates there. Free will, and particularly God's connection with free will and whether we have it, and questions about the structure and nature of time. I think those are two separate debates. They overlap and they intersect, of course, but I think they're really ultimately independent.
Well, free will, and whether or not it exists, or we have it, or that any creature or sentience could have it, is an argument within time. So let me step out to another dimension and talk about time itself, because one of the things I don't think is rarely ever discussed is what is the purpose of time itself. We can talk about purpose within time, but humorously, I think there's a saying, and it's been attributed to many people and may be an apocryphal saying. I think Mark Twain is the person it's most attributed to, is that time is the thing that prevents everything from happening at once. And that's humorous in a certain way, but it's also pretty profound. So if we grant that there is time, and that it is not epiphenomenal, that it's not culturally based, that it's not circular, that somehow what we perceive and have evolved to perceive as time seeming to move from A to B to C through Z and onward, then why? I mean, and is that even knowable? Does that go up against human limits of knowledge, and even the limits of knowledge itself?
I think for myself, I'm inclined to see the way things are at, say, the ultimate level of however we want to describe them, at sort of the ultimate fundamental level, that there really aren't answers to those kinds of why questions.
Yeah.
That you reach a point where there just are no more explanations. Explanations, Wittgenstein said, they have to end somewhere. And I think that's one of the places where we just reach rock bottom. Just like we reach rock bottom, why we ask why the constant in the laws of gravity is the particular number that it is.
Yeah.
It's just a rock bottom feature of the way the world happened to be.
Yeah.
And maybe there are other worlds where things are different, but in our world, that is just sort of a rock bottom truth.
Well, let me end this segment, and in the final segment, I'll let you sum up your thoughts and talk about anything that we maybe haven't talked about. But do you think that philosophically, for example, the idea of a multiverse or an omniverse or multiple universes, do you think that it's conceivable that time itself may operate in different ways, even, let's say, in a far-off corner of this universe, and that there could be, let's say, we keep finding exoplanets now for the last 20 years, and just recently this week, supposedly the closest star, Proxima Centauri, has quote-unquote an Earth-like world. Do you think that if there are some kind of sentient creatures there, that they may have a totally different way of perceiving change that we would call time, but they might have a totally different concept.
Absolutely. If you take, as sort of has been in the background in many of the things I've been trying to articulate, if you take Kant's view, which is very difficult to summarize, but roughly that space and time are features that are part of what makes human experience possible. So our experience of a world is possible only if things are structured into roughly spatio-temporal relations. And those spatial-temporal relations, for us, happen to be that time is linear, that it moves in one direction, that its rate doesn't increase or decrease, that it doesn't branch, that it's open-ended. All those are facts about perhaps what is necessary for us to experience the world. If we imagine a world with beings that are radically different from us, they very well may experience what we might call time, but would have a completely different structure. I think that's absolutely possible. It's possible even for beings here.
Yeah.
We can wonder whether dogs and cats construct a timeline in the way in which we do.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned cats, because I know I have 4 cats, and I've read on cats how they have a very short-term memory. Yes, if something traumatic, if some kid down the block tries to set them on fire, they'll retain that. But usually after 4 or 5 days, when they wake up again, their short-term memory is such that they will remember that you're their master or something, but they won't hold the kind of grudges. They don't have the same kind of retention, and maybe it's just simply because they have smaller, less complex brains, but it's just an interesting thought. But anyway, let's end this segment. In the final segment, I'll give you any closing thoughts, and we'll do that in a moment. I've been speaking with philosopher Eric Rubenstein about the nature of time, some of the classical questions, some of his own personal opinions. If I've missed anything, or you have any further comments on time, or you want to sum up your thoughts, please do so. And also then tell me a little bit about any research you have coming up, or any papers, regardless of whether it has to do with time or not. So any thoughts final on time?
Let's see. Well, of course, as you know, with philosophy, the conversation never really ends. There's always more to be said. For me, what I've been interested in lately is continuing with that idea that I mentioned before about trying to understand the structure of time by focusing on the relations between events and what those relations are and how we might best represent time, be it with a line or with a ray or with a fork. One of the things that I'm interested in is taking that kind of focus on relations and trying to understand something about the way it works within time by looking at other areas where relations are key. And a good example would be numbers. The number 3, the number itself, 3, doesn't seem to really have any particular properties of its own other than the fact that it is the number that comes after 2 and it is the number that comes before 4. That is part of what makes it the particular number that it is its relation within a whole.
Yeah.
Likewise, you might say for color, what makes a reddish orange, the particular shade it is, has to do with its relations to other colors.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of focus on the structure of the relational whole that helps us understand the phenomenon in question. And my present research is wanting to take those kinds of examples and see how far we can go when we apply them to time.
Well, let me just ask you here, would that be time relational to the individual events that happen within it, or time relational to proposed essences outside of time?
I think it would be time as a relational whole, where the things that are related could either be just moments in time or events that occur in time.
Okay.
So I would want to keep the focus on what's related fairly narrow,
Okay.
as traditionally has been done.
Okay. Well, anyone who's enjoyed the conversation with Eric Rubenstein, I'll have a link to his webpage. It's at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And just off the top of my head, it's odd. Was that one of those old Indian schools where Native Americans were brought into Pennsylvania to be civilized? Is that why it's called Indiana, or is it related to the state?
That's a good question. I'm embarrassed to say I'm not sure.
Okay.
There are a number of towns within Pennsylvania that have unusual names. There's California University of Pennsylvania. Okay. There's Paris. Pennsylvania just has a wide assortment of names of towns.
Okay.
Indiana
it just came to me as I was looking at the webpage. But anyway, I want to thank you for your time and your expertise. And as I said, anyone who has enjoyed it can contact Eric at his webpage. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.